one thing to accomplish. Get that young girl out of there alive. That's all. I understand. I think you do.
Come with me as we explore the world of the unknown. A world that most are too afraid to look into. Welcome to Taboo, Matthew.
Hello everybody and welcome again to Taboo Matthew. I'm your host as always, Matt Sheets, and it is the first day of 2025, according to our glorious leaders, that is. And it's already a pretty fucking crazy day. I don't know how many of y'all have been seeing what's going on, but there's already been a terrorist attack in New Orleans. There's a lot going around about this fog going around that seems to not be natural fog. I saw a video recently of some guy left some cat food out, some wet cat food, when it was foggy, and it was growing hair out of the cat food. That's a little disturbing. Not sure if there's any correlation, but there was a couple other videos of hair growing out of like cat poop in the yard, and these are crazy times, people. These are crazy times. Elon Musk is showing his true colors. Donald Trump is starting to show his true colors now that he thinks he's a shoo-in. Crazy times, crazy times. Today's episode is going to be about the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations, which is, it's a pretty deep rabbit hole. I dived in as far as I wanted to. It took me a little longer than I had thought, so I have quite a bit for you guys. I think this is going to be a good episode. My disclaimer, as always, is when I was doing my research, everything I'm about to present to you was presented to me as fact. So, in accordance, I'm going to present it to you exactly as it was presented to me, as fact. And this is intended for entertainment purposes only. Now, I've been hearing a lot over the past decade and a half about Tavistock Institute. It was always just, something involving the Beatles or rock and roll or rap groups or, artists that had a really, really big cultural impact on the Western civilization. Sometimes it had to do with the CIA and the hippie movement, free love, that kind of thing. I've heard they were embedded with all the major intelligence agencies, CIA, MI6, Mossad. All those are usual cast of characters. I heard that they were a major driving force in the climate change agenda, but I never really knew what they were. I mean, I kind of just took the name at face values that they're, human relations. So I decided this next episode was going to be about Tavistock, and it's a good one. You're going to want to listen to this. So here we go. Now, this first part, as usual, is taken directly from the Tavistock website, from the Wikipedia, from what I would call official sources, where I think most people would get their information about Tavistock. The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations is a research and consulting organization that is headquartered in London, United Kingdom. They specialize in how humans behave in groups and organizations. They use what are called social science methods to study these organizations and individuals. It is labeled as a nonprofit and has sister organizations in China and Germany. They publish a peer-reviewed journal with Sage Publications called Human Relations, and they also host the journal Evaluation. They claim their aim is to enable learning and change to take control for people and planet. And whatever the fuck that means. So the Tavistock Institute offers research, consultancy, project evaluation, work project evaluation work, and professional development programs based on unique methodologies drawn from social sciences and applied psychology. Their methods include system psychodynamics, complexity theory, theory of change, and social dreaming. The main method is experiential learning, learning through experience. The Institute's website, sorry, I'm a little bit early, still getting my voice, so bear with me. The Institute's website describes its work as having a focus on how humans relate to each other and non-human systems, how people grow and learn and affect creativity and change in groups, basically. The Institute was formally founded in 1947, but it is said to have come from its spiritual predecessor, the Tavistock Clinic, which did a lot of work in World War II. During the war, the Tavistock Clinic played key roles in the British Army psychiatry. Working closely with the Royal Army Medical Corps and the British Army, they were responsible for the War Office Selections Board and the Civil Resettlement Unit. The War Office Selection Boards, or as the Brits call it, the WASBs, was a scheme they used during World War II to select their potential officers for the British Army. And the Civil Resettlement Units, called CRUS, was a scheme to help the British servicemen who were POWs transition back into civilian life. The group from the clinic were fascinated by working with groups and organizations and wanted to continue this research after the war. Initially, they were reported to want to become a part of the National Health Service after the war. When they found out that that type of consultancy and research wouldn't be possible with the NHS, they decided to create the Tavistock Institute. After a generous grant from none other than the Rockefeller Foundation, the Tavistock Institute came to life in 1947. They also played integral roles in the development of fish sticks, Bovril, which is a sticky meat extract paste similar to yeast extract. I've never heard of it, but from my understanding, the Brits are pretty familiar with it. Coffee, hairstyles, hospitals, and we are talking everything from how to organizing the cleaning staff in the hospital to how to operate entire wards. They've been integral in that. Read into that however you want. Recently, they serve larger purposes working with such entities as the British government and European Commission. And they've worked with many companies early on, including Unilever, Shell, Bayer, and many others. Many others. This is officially. So that's their narrative. But when you dive in a little deeper, there's a much different story that is behind the Tavistock Institute. Now, this is going to bounce around a little bit, but it all relates. So just stick around. I promise there's a method to my madness. To really understand Tavistock, we need an introduction to its roots in the Committee of 300 and the Wellington House. Now, around 1000 AD, the Eastern Orthodox Church was brought back from Constantinople by the Rus, the Vikings, the Rus princes. They held womanhood to a very high standard and believed it needed to be revered and protected. The Rus were very familiar with the Khazars and their disdain for women. One of the main objectives of Tavistock even today is the degradation of women. The Khazars were an Indo-Turk barbarian horde who adopted Judaic religion after a decree by their king Bulan. Actually, the Star of David you see on the Israeli flags, all the so-called Zionists or Jews use nowadays, that comes from the personal flag of their soothsayer, magician, sorcerer, David El Roy. It doesn't have anything to do with King David from the Bible. That's a common misconception. It was also, the Star of David, was the Khazarian national flag when they first got sent packing from what is now modern-day Russia into what is now current-day Poland. The princes of Moscow earned an unending hatred by the Khazarian lines, namely the Rothschilds, after Prince Donskoy defeated and expelled the Khazarians from the lower regions of the Volga into present-day Poland. That's why many of the Zionists you see today have Polish names that they change, or that they, just flat out from Poland, like Netanyahu. So as these Khazarian Jews, also known as the Committee of 300, began to develop their plans to destroy Western civilization, Russia became the main, if not the first, target. The first opportunity created by Tavistock, then going by the name Wellington House, was in 1905. Jacob Schiff, a doughboy for the Rothschilds and Wall Street banker, bankrolled the Japanese to attack the Russian fleet in Port Arthur. This began the Russo-Japanese War. It is said the Rockefeller-owned Standard Oil Company engineered this war against Russia. All of the propaganda for this war on both sides was engineered by Tavistock, again, then going by Wellington House. Here's an interesting side note. In 1941, another Rockefeller front organization, the Institute for Pacific Relations, gave large sums of money to its sister organization in Tokyo. They then funneled that money through Richard Sorge, a Russian master spy, to the Japanese imperial family to get them to attack the U.S. at Pearl Harbor. So they've been at it for a while, coming from many, many angles. This Committee of 300 has roots that run back a long, long time. Many trace them to the Phoenician Canaanite magicians or Babylonian magicians, depending on who you ask. But the start that I could trace all the way back goes back to a group of Khazar Jewish merchants operating mostly out of Britain and Germany. Now, most have heard of Amschel Rothschild creating the Bavarian Illuminati in 1776, but the most notable rise that I could find from these men came from the British East India Company. They were the cabal that was behind going to India and buying up all the opium and then wholesale pushing it into China and Southeast Asia, sometimes even by military force. That's an interesting story, too, if you ever have some time. The Committee of 300 itself is a very deep dive that deserves a hard look, and maybe another time in another episode we'll do that together. Also in the late 1800s, there was a Russian white loyalist named Arthur Sharep-Spiridovich. He was renowned for predicting major world events due to his knowledge in international affairs. He was a Russian general and count who in 1902 warned kings and dukes in Europe about how there would be many assassination attempts in the upcoming years. He also predicted the First World War, making his prediction based on his knowledge of what he called the Hidden Hand, which was a group of 300 Jewish families. These families, he claimed, controlled most world events. Arthur then emigrated to New York and wrote a book called The Secret World Government, or The Hidden Hand. This book was an expose of these deceptive families that control the world's political and economic system. Again, these Ashkenazi Khazar Jews that I think a lot of us are becoming more and more familiar with. Arthur was found dead in his hotel room in New York in 1926. Naturally, it was ruled a suicide. Go figure. Was Arthur Sharep-Spiridovich one of the first known casualties of Tavistock's rise? I don't know. This Committee of 300 is the hidden hand behind most of these major wars and events. The first person I could find that called him out by that name, the Committee of 300, was the Jewish German Minister of Foreign Affairs, Walter Rathenau. He said, and I quote, 300 men, all of whom know one another, guide the economic destinies of the continent and seek their successors from within their own environment. Now, it bears mentioning that Walter was assassinated in 1922. His death was blamed on right-wing Germans, supposedly the predecessors to the Nazi Party. So, whatever you may believe, there's a trail of bodies that accompany anyone who was speaking out against this Committee of 300 around those times. Now, the Russian Revolution, as many are coming to see today, was never a revolution of the people. It was an infiltration by a foreign people, the Khazar Jews, backed by the Committee of 300, and idealized by Tavistock. again then going by Wellington House. In the words of Winston Churchill, they transported Lenin in a sealed truck like a plague bacillus from Switzerland into Russia. Then once they were established, Lenin and Trotsky seized Russia by the hair of its head. According to John Coleman, the Arnold Toynbee papers and Bruce Lockhart's private papers stated without the covert aid of Toynbee, Lockhart, MI6, along with Great Britain, Germany, Finland, Switzerland, and Sweden, all of these countries pretending to be friendly with the royal court in St. Petersburg, Russia, the Russian Revolution would not have been possible. And while the U.S. wasn't directly involved in the Bolshevik takeover, they did support the cause. This is blatantly evident by how our president at that time, good old Woodrow Wilson, who will be coming up a lot in this story, issued Trotsky, that foreign-born violent revolutionary, a U.S. passport. Now, I think we should all take a moment here and think about what that entails. That Woodrow Wilson issued Trotsky, who was some say the military mind leader of a violent revolution that killed countless people, a U.S. passport. So there was never any neutrality with the U.S. Let's be honest about that. Now, all this comes back to Tavistock through Alfred Milner, the Fabian socialist. According to Milner, it was through Tavistock, then Wellington House, that Fritz Platten, another socialist, planned and oversaw the logistics of Lenin's trip into Russia. This is corroborated in the Wilhelmstrasse files. Also in the Wilhelmstrasse files was the accusation that Lenin's trip into Russia was authorized by General Ludendorff and Kaiser Wilhelm, which I'd actually heard before that Germany, obviously at the time, were fighting Russia in World War I, so they had a vested interest, obviously, in bringing the current power structure in Russia down, which is wild because the Kaiser, the Tsar, the kings, the royal family in England, I mean, they were all related. This is one big family that are just sending millions of young men to die to fight each other. It was also Lord Alfred Milner to which Lenin went when he needed more money for the revolution. Milner agreed to give money on the condition he could send his MI6 agent Bruce Lockhart to supervise the day-to-day affairs and report back to Milner. The Rothschilds and Rockefellers also demanded that they send their doughboy Sidney Riley to ensure the transfer of Russia's natural resources and gold rubles to London. Lenin and Trotsky both agreed to these demands, and the sealing of this deal came with Lord Milner sending 60 million pounds of gold sovereigns, and the Rockefellers sending $40 million to Lenin in Russia to fund his violent revolution against the Tsars of Russia. And I think a lot of us know how that turned out. Okay. While all of this was going on in Europe and Asia, Tavistock was also hard at work in the U.S. Now, these Tavistock and Committee of 300 emissaries, namely Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann, were Woodrow Wilson's handlers for all intents and purposes. Bernays actually happened to be the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who to me was a very, very evil man. I mean, Bernays and Sigmund, just not good people. Bernays created what we know as modern-day consumerism, this drive to just buy and have better and idolize, always having more money and more clout. Bernays and Lippmann set up the Creel Commission to aid Wilson in his propaganda efforts against the American people. The deceptive language of the Federal Reserve Act was created under the guidance of Bernays and Lippmann. Together with Samuel Uttermeyer, they set up the National Citizens League to promote the idea of a central bank. As many know, this was a ploy to secure control of the people's money and transfer it to a private monopoly. The Federal Reserve, IRS, they're not part of our U.S. government. They're private banks run by multinational bankers. And this was all without consent of the American people. That's why they kind of foisted it, December 23rd, when everybody was going to Christmas. They held the vote to pass the Federal Reserve Act, and Woodrow Wilson signed it into law very quickly. An interesting piece that I found about the Federal Reserve Act when I was doing this research is that it was sent to Colonel Edward Mandell House as the representative of Wellington House, and J.P. Morgan as a representative of the British oligarchs. Now, why would two British entities need to approve a central banking act for the United States? Don't we think that's a little peculiar? Now, after World War I, Tavistock went into overdrive, pushing the degradation of morality, especially onto women. They declared an all-out war on all wholesome elements of Western society. This strange sense of rebellion set in on Europe and the U.S. and changed the way people behaved and viewed the world. A lot of people brushed it off as people being sick of war and politics, or as, a youth rebellion. You know how kids are. In reality, it was what's called an interdirectional conditioning, and Tavistock was the main pusher of this mind disease. This influence was very easy to see in Germany, where we find the first well-documented cases of transgenderism being pushed by these same Khazar Jews Committee of 300 puppets. It all relates back to the same people. I know how that sounds to some people, but it just does. It keeps coming back to these same people. In the 1930s, Tavistock found a new plan to add to the old bag of tricks. A German mathematician named Oswald Spengler wrote a book titled The Decline of Western Civilization. Now, he wrote this book as a warning to the West on what would bring about their demise, and he took those ideas from the fall of Rome and Greece. Tavistock took this book and they used it as a blueprint to fast-track their one-world government that they so covet. The main tenet of this is to introduce an alien element into the society in ever-increasing numbers. Failing to dispel this new element, Western civilization's inward beliefs and sound convictions would contradict its outward profession, and thus its fate would be sealed. Western civilization would fall, and they would usher in their new world order. Does that sound familiar? Sound like something that perhaps might be going on today? I don't know. Now, according to Tavistock's own papers, during World War II, the strategic bombing survey developed by Tavistock was a key piece of psychological warfare that forced Germany to its knees. For those that don't know, the Strategic Bombing Survey was a program whereby the RAF and U.S. Army Air Force conducted almost round-the-clock bombing of German workers' quarters and civilian centers. Some of you may be familiar with places like Dresden, Germany, that was firebombed in the middle of the night to the tune of 25,000 or more men, women, and children being burned to death in their homes. And that's not even to mention all the other German cities, the Italian cities, and all the civilians we killed in Japan leading up to dropping 2 atomic bombs on, again, civilian centers, not military targets. Tavistock played a major part in ushering in not only the Bolshevik Revolution, which killed tens of millions of people, but 2 world wars that killed probably 100 million more, and cost Germany a quarter of its native population. It did irreparable damage to Germany and Great Britain by channeling all of their intellectual energies into war, right? Thereby letting these Khazarian Jews plan decades or centuries ahead in the cover of darkness, while everybody else was otherwise preoccupied. This was the start of the decline of this great Anglo-Saxon Nordic Alpine civilization. The beauty of their literature, art, classics, spiritual and moral advancement is what set that civilization apart from the rest of the world. This mixed with the protection and advancement of the female sex, is now being lost to time. Spangler spoke of the need to protect these elements of that society, and Tavistock used them as the main targets to bring this civilization down and usher in this one-world government. From all the research I've done, these evil Committee of 300, Khazarian Jews, whatever you want to call them, that's kind of their MO. I think there's even more evil beings behind them, and that's the reason they can only do this, but their MO is to pervert. I don't think they can really ever create anything that's unique, not anything that's good for sure. So they just take what's created and they pervert it into something that is just a twisted, just piece of shit. That's my opinion, of course. Now, in 1945, Tavistock sent the Jewish German-born psychologist Kurt Lewin to MIT to start the Research Center for Group Dynamics. Soon after, it moved to the University of Michigan and became the Institute for Social Research. Through his previous work on mass psychology and this new institute, Lewin was integral in the formation of the OSS, the precursor to our current-day CIA. Tavistock also had a huge hand in the development of the Office of Naval Intelligence, as well as NATO. NATO was created by a Tavistock minion named Willis Harman at Stanford University. As of our current day, Tavistock runs over 30 research institutes in the U.S., and that's just the ones that they claim, right? I think it's many, many more. During the 1950s, Edward Bernays, Tavistock's little American do-boy, was still hard at work, pushing propaganda for his masters. He spearheaded a campaign alleging Guatemala was falling under communist control. This resulted in a U.S.-led coup that overthrew their government and installed a regime that was friendly to the Khazar Jew Committee's interests, namely that of the United Fruit Corporation. Bernays even went on to write a book about this experience titled The Engineering of Consent. They clearly felt at this point, after their two major wars that they'd orchestrated, that they didn't even have to hide their evil deeds anymore. There was nothing the people of the world could do to stop them. And looking at the world now, I hate to say it, but I think they might have been right. At that point in time, anyway. We'll see how it all unfolds. Now that brings us to the 1970s. In the 1970s, Tavistock and its many think tanks and other organizations implemented a dramatic paradigm shift in the education system. They began to award students credit for courses in civics instead of reading, writing, and arithmetic. This led up to the 1980 Tavistock Conference led by a man named Maurice Strong. Maurice Strong was a Canadian oil and businessman. The main company that he headed was called Petro-Canada, and it was a known company of the Olympians, which is another name for the Committee of 300. I've heard a couple references that say, like our intelligence services, when they reference the Committee of 300, they call them the Olympians. Maurice was also a known MI6 man, and he had been a colonel in Britain not in Britain, but for Canada, fighting obviously for the United Kingdom during World War II. It's also rumored that Strong, along with Aldous Huxley, both of them were responsible for much of the LSD wave that had swept through the U.S. and later Europe. During this conference in 1980, Strong gathered occult think tankers, social engineers, cybernetic experts, and so-called futurologists, among other people. The main topics of discussion: the women's liberation movement, black consciousness, racial mixing, and breaking down taboos against mixed marriages, pushing the narrative that colored races were superior to Western civilization whites. It's rumored that this is the conference when they kind of nominated Oprah Winfrey to be one of these new chosen ones to push this narrative of, mixed marriages, colored people being superior, blah, blah, blah. And then they went on to discuss youth rebellion, emerging interest in social responsibilities in business, the generation gap, implying a changing paradigm, the anti-technological bias of many young people, pushing new family structures, especially normalizing of homosexuality and lesbianism as being no different than any other nuclear family with a husband and a wife and children. They discussed the climate change agenda, Eastern religious and philosophical perspectives, a renewed interest in fundamentalist Christianity, labor unions shifting emphasis to quality of the work environment, pushing Kabbalah as a replacement to Christianity. A few of those chosen to spearhead this little campaign of propaganda for Kabbalah were Shirley MacLaine, Roseanne Barr, and then later on Madonna and Demi Moore. And then the last few things that they discussed were the reinvention of music, especially hip-hop, by pushing gangster rap into the black culture, and a new form of English that would be so mutilated as to be unintelligible to most. So this is back clear in 1980, and I think we can see a lot of those things are coming to life even in 2025. Leading up to the Gulf War in the early 90s, Tavistock's American minions went into overdrive. First, the U.S. Department of Defense, which I've always thought that the U.S. Department of Defense is quite the title for a department that is solely on the offensive. I don't think I've ever seen them defend anything, right, except the bullshit that they do. They shut out all the news media outlets and rolled out their personal little spokesman to report on all the events taking place around Iraq. This is also where they introduced their new Tavistock-developed term, collateral damage, to warp the opinion on the massive amounts of civilian casualties and destruction of non-military property. They really started to dehumanize the killing and destruction they were doing over there and package it in a nice little pill that was easy for most Americans to swallow. And I would say that campaign was pretty successful. Then, miraculously, CNN alone was allowed to cover and report on the overwhelming success of the Patriot missile defense system shooting down Iraqi Scuds that were being shot at Israel. CNN reported that at least one Scud was shot down by the U.S. every single night. Then, when the World in Review did a report stating that in fact not a single Scud had been shot down, it kind of just started to blow up in their face. Not a single news outlet, aside from World in Review, dared to report that Scud missiles had in fact hit Tel Aviv and other parts of Israel. But the worst violation by far from these little Tavistock minions came through one of their largest public relations companies in the U.S., Hilton and Knowles. The Kuwaiti ambassador paid Hilton and Knowles $600,000 to help coach and stage the scene that swayed Congress to give Bush Sr. authorization to attack Iraq. The daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S. gave a heartfelt testimony full of tears and pleas to the U.S. Congress on how she had witnessed Iraqi soldiers pulling newborn babies out of incubators and killing them in other vile ways. The problem with all this, that woman hadn't been to Kuwait in years. She'd been in Washington, D.C., hanging around with her daddy. And no such events actually ever took place. I think the real reason for the U.S. invading Iraq becomes very apparent when you consider the very day the U.S. invaded Kuwait to get to Iraq, Iraq attacked Israel. That might be a little key piece in there. Now, John Rawlings Rees was one of the main characters in charge of the official starting of Tavistock back in 1947. And he's wrote quite a few books, and if you go and read them, he makes it pretty clear what their strategy was and would continue to be. And I quote, public life, politics, and industry should all of them be within our sphere of influence. If we are to infiltrate the professional and social activities of other people, I think we must imitate the totalitarians and organize some kind of fifth column activity. If better ideas on mental health are to progress and spread, we, as the salesmen, must lose our identity. Let us all, therefore, very secretly be fifth columnists. We must aim to make it permeate every educational activity in our national life. Primary, secondary, university, and technical education are all concerned with varying stages in the development of the child and adolescent. Especially since the last World War, we have done much to infiltrate the various social organizations throughout the country. And in their work and in their point of view, one can see clearly how the principles for which this society and others stood in the past have become accepted as part of the ordinary working plan of these various bodies. That is as it should be. And while we can take heart from this, we must be healthily discontented and realize that there is still more work to be done along this line. Similarly, we have made a useful attack upon a number of professions. The two easiest of them, naturally, are the teaching profession and the church. The two most difficult are law and medicine. Now, that's all the quotes I thought relevant to this. I mean, I could go on and on. He's got a million quotes that just show what a vile piece of trash he is. But I think you get the point, that these are weak men, and they aim to control through deception and covert strategy by attacking our culture, especially where we're most vulnerable, women and children. Now, Tavistock is rumored to have taken many of its tactics on fragmentation of the mind and mass psychology from none other than Sigmund Freud. Tavistock's research on shell shock, post-traumatic stress, and propaganda got a major start from Freud's strategy of fragmenting the personality or mind. Freud was pivotal in mapping the human mind's response to trauma. Freud was renowned for his brainwashing of his students, even causing Carl Jung, Victor Tosk, Herbert Silberger, and William Reich to have mental breakdowns. Tavistock also utilized Carl Jung's work on metaphysics as a type of carrot on a stick for the masses. His work on mythologies and how they play out in the group psyche is used as a type of hope dope. They nurture this idea of good and evil being played out in each of us, which I don't think is necessarily wrong, but what they do is they inverted it to flip people's view of what is good and what is evil. And through that, they're able to attain unquestioned authority over those individuals too dull to see through the veil of deception. Because if somebody thinks something is inherently evil, they're not even going to look into it or hear its side of the story. It's just going to be dismissed offhand, which I think a lot of us see nowadays. Now we're going to get into a little bit of what I could find on some of the music artists associated with Tavistock. It was the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, Grateful Dead, The Doors, Frank Zappa, Michael Jackson, NWA, and there's many, many more. I just didn't want to sit here for 8 minutes listing off musical acts. There's a whole nother subject or rabbit hole we could go down about how Tavistock and their influenced organizations infiltrate or outright create every new wave of music, from rock and roll to gangster rap to pop. They seem to be in everything, and they use that as a major form of mind control. Rap music, as well as hip-hop, is rumored to be a program run by Tavistock. I think maybe not initially. I think hip-hop did have some grassroots starts in Queens or wherever over there in New York. But Tavistock has clearly created the lyrics and pushed it into American culture to fuel the gang wars in major U.S. cities. According to Dr. John Coleman, who we'll get into here in a little bit, The music companies that are directly run or influenced by Tavistock are Time Warner, Sony, Bertelsmann, EMI, Capital Group, Seagram Canada, Philips Electronic, and the Indies. Now, originally, these companies implanted mostly subliminal messages in their music to affect the psyche of the masses. Nowadays, it's not even so subliminal. They don't even hide it. Violence, sex, lawlessness, homosexuality, drugs, and Satanism, as well as many other detrimental motifs, are pushed through every genre of music in Western society. Now, as well as music, Tavistock has a major hand in media. From their informal beginnings at Wellington House, demonizing the Kaiser through newspapers and Hollywood, to Hitler in World War II, Saddam in the 90s and early 2000s, and even pushing a false link between Saddam and the Taliban in Afghanistan, right up to our current day and everything in between. Tavistock has held sway over what propaganda is disseminated to the masses. Personalities and outlets that are controlled include Larry King, Tucker Carlson, Fox News, CNN, Oliver North, Michael Savage, and many, many others. Basically, if you're a high-profile journalist, you are at the very least influenced by Tavistock, if not outright controlled. Their aim is to convince the public that we are morally right in any endeavor that serves their agenda, right? It's back to that flipping the perception of what is good and what is evil. When you look back on our history, the main powers of our government have never used a show of force for anything you can even justify as morally good. The brainwashed will point at World War II, of course, and somehow justify the U.S. and Britain running almost 24-hour bombing raids on civilians, which clearly is objectively evil. I mean, there was not only no need for that, it was not as much of a just war as people like to say. And how the media convinced anyone that was right or necessary, I'll never understand. But to me, it just speaks to the capabilities to convince otherwise good people that evil atrocities are justified. And that's a very scary reality. I think it should make all of us take a look deep within ourselves. Because whether we like it or not, anybody who's paid taxes in America since, 1913, we're complicit in this. And we need to do more to stop it. Dr. John Coleman, who I've mentioned a few times, was a British MI6 officer for over 35 years. He was given access to a secret library in the British Museum in London, and this is where he's reported to have found most of these secret documents on the real history of Tavistock. He was the main guy, from what I can find, in exposing most of what Tavistock has done. There's other people that have done a lot of work on it too, but his work seems to be the most comprehensive. He wrote a book called The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, Shaping the Moral, Spiritual, Cultural, and Political and Economic Decline of the United States of America. Now, according to Dr. Coleman, Tavistock was secretly created in 1913 at Wellington House, though its roots and ideals go back much further, as we've discussed. It was originally tasked with creating propaganda to persuade the British public to go to war with Germany. Some of this propaganda was that Germans were going into France and Belgium and raping women and cutting off the hands of children. Just a lot of crazy, crazy shit. Tavistock was said to develop, or at least perfect, the tactic of vilifying the leader and people of a country that they were trying to sway the public into hating. You can still find some of the absolutely ridiculous propaganda about Kaiser Wilhelm from that time. I mean, they were doing pictures of him that looked like a gorilla dog, man, and just wild, wild shit. The real reason for that war was that the British government was increasingly worried about how quickly the German nation was becoming a powerhouse in global affairs. I'm sure many remember the relentless onslaught of propaganda when they were trying to get us to go into Iraq, into Libya, into Syria, not to mention Germany in the 1930s or Vietnam in the 1960s. And I can tell you firsthand how powerful that propaganda is. I've spoken to many otherwise intelligent people, or what I view as intelligent, and they speak about how horrible Saddam was and how horrible Gaddafi was and how we were right in what we did. And anytime you ask them for proof to back, the atrocities we committed to go in and dethrone those men, it's always some outlandish bullshit that most of the time never even happened or is not even comparable to the things we do in retaliation. I mean, it's just a joke. If you'll recall the story we talked about the Iraqi soldiers killing newborn babies in Kuwait, that's one of them. Tavistock initially in 1913 was financed by the royal family and then the Rothschilds, right? It's always coming back around. Woodrow Wilson around that time had a direct line through the Morgan Company to Tavistock to get his daily briefings. Now, this is at the behest of the Committee of 300. Woodrow Wilson, as you may know, was responsible for the Federal Reserve and the IRS, as well as being the first American president to proclaim himself in favor of a socialist government as part of a socialist New World Order or one world government. That alone should have been reason to impeach his ass and try him for treason. He also was the president that tore down our tariff system, which was, how the government used to be funded before taxes, and it was what protected American workers from the free trade that has ravaged U.S. manufacturing by flooding our markets with cheap, inferior goods from, UK at that time, but it's been China, Vietnam, Mexico, anywhere they can get slave labor and make cheaper, shittier shit and outsource all of our manufacturing labor. They do that. And that the start of that was Woodrow Wilson getting rid of our tariff system. And all those things has almost completely eroded our middle class, which they know was a big impediment to their one world government, is a strong middle class. In my opinion, Woodrow Wilson was quite likely our worst president, and that's quite an achievement because we've had some really terrible presidents, especially recently, but really throughout our whole history. Just some evil men that did nothing but serve the agenda of themselves and their globalist masters. Now, another claim from Dr. Coleman's book is that Tavistock is one of the major sources of propaganda that is disseminated through the media in the West. Something we already went over, but this is kind of just a summation of Dr. Coleman's thoughts on Tavistock. They created the strategy of using news media to distribute polling results as a way to convince people that the majority is already thinking in a certain way. Right? It's right back to that, trying to give you your opinion, convince you what's good and what's evil. I'm sure many of us have heard of a Gallup poll. The Gallup poll was developed by George Gallup around the time of World War II. But of course, who do we find helping Mr. Gallup, or most likely teaching and ordering George Gallup about the proper polling techniques? You guessed it, a Tavistock psychologist named Gardner Murphy. Tavistock also created the terms mass brainwashing, collateral damage, isolationists, which was a term they used to make those against war seem bad, and regime change. In our current day, there are Tavistock people inside the presidential cabinet that make decisions on policy. That's how influential they've become. In just a little over 100 years, they're not even just doing the think tanks and giving people consultation anymore. They're in the cabinets. They're in our government. Some of the quotes from Dr. John Coleman's book on the Tavistock Institute that really stuck out to me are, and I quote, Tavistock has the majority of the American people profiled and brainwashed. If any part of the American public is ever to identify the cause of the crisis they have washed over this nation in the past 70 years, the social engineering structure built by Tavistock will come crashing down. But that has not happened yet. Tavistock continues to drown the American public in its sea of created public opinion. Then I had one more. The enemy is clearly identifiable as the Committee of 300, the Club of Rome, NATO, the Council on Foreign Relations, and all of its affiliate organizations, the think tanks and research institutes controlled by Stanford, and last but certainly not least, the military establishment. So from a lot of my studies, it's reported that the majority of CIA and MI6 operatives get their training at Tavistock Institute. The curriculum: metaphysics, mind control, behavior modification, ESP, hypnotism, esoteric knowledge, Satanism, Manichaean theology, which is the study of the duality of good and evil. The list of Tavistock-affiliated groups I was able to find was quite lengthy, but it includes the likes of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Club of Rome, Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderberg Group, CIA, MI6, Mossad, the Stanford Research Institute, the Brookings Institute, the Rand Corporation, the International Monetary Fund, NASA, the World Bank, the Project for a New American Century, Wharton School, the Pilgrim Society, Chatham House, the Committee of 300, or the Olympians, as we've previously covered, NATO, the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Federal Reserve, the IRS, the Aspen Institute of Colorado, the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, and countless other think tanks, NGOs, and organizations that don't have any names officially. It seems to be a spider web of deception that would take a lifetime to fully unweave. And just like its presence in the present, its beginning is just as tangled of a web. From the drug cartel responsible for the Chinese opium wars, and even America's opium epidemic that I think we're still in the throes of, to Aleister Crowley or the Theosophical Society, or the open conspiracy with H.G. Wells and Cecil Rhodes and all those other Fabian socialists, Karl Marx and the Frankfurt School, or Sigmund Freud, or even its unofficial start at Wellington House. The tentacles of this filthy organization run very deep, and they penetrate into every aspect of our culture. So for me, what I've just presented is just a small taste of what is out there for anyone to find out about Tavistock and this beast of human mental manipulation that Tavistock has really propagated onto the whole Western society. Not even just Western. I mean, I think they're over in China doing the same thing, Japan, India. I encourage anyone that's interested to take an objective look for yourself. I mean, whether you think all this is completely shit, go take a look. But do it very carefully, because once you do, you'll begin to see how successful these campaigns that they've waged are, not just in music, media, politics, all the other ways we've discussed, but you'll start to see it in the people closest to you and even in yourself, about how they've built these beliefs that we all hold. And I know this can lead to bitterness and contempt for the people, right? For the people that love you and the people that actually do care about you. And to me, that's another divisive tactic that I think we can't afford. We're already under attack by too many. So whatever you do with this information, don't let it divide us even more, because I think I've shown enough proof to show that that's their whole goal, is to keep us divided so they can just keep taking more and more and more. Now we'll get to the opinion part of this broadcast. So as a lot of you that have listened to any of my other podcasts know, this part gets a little spicy. Remember, this is just my personal opinion. Again, I'm just a simple podcaster and I don't know shit. but I think some of you might agree. So the moral, spiritual, racial, economic, cultural, and intellectual decay that we see today is not a natural process by any stretch. And I think that they've tried to push that narrative that it is. It's not something that just happened. It is a very careful and calculated plan by evil men. They sell us this Luciferian duality that comes from these mystery schools, whether it's to the left wing as a utopian idealism where life is fair and everyone gets the same, or to the right wing as this patriotic national security where we're all safe from any harm. It's just another divisive tactic. And these groups are masters at manipulating the group consciousness and selling us on a false reality. And Tavistock is the major representative of this, right? It's not the only one, but it's definitely had a big hand in developing where we are today. I think you hear a lot like the CIA is responsible for gangster rap, or the Illuminati is behind counterculture of the 60s. You know, Mossad was responsible for 9/11. The thing is, all these institutions' names are interchangeable. You could say Mossad is behind gangster rap. You could say the CIA started the transgender movement. And you'd be right to a degree, right? Obviously, we all know the CIA wasn't formally around back then in the 1920s. What I'm trying to say is these shadow entities, the Khazar, Zionists, Committee of 300, CIA, MI6, Hidden Hand, Mossad, Club of Rome, etc., 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 on and on, they're all the same people. Or they work for the same people. Most of them that we hear of are the lower-end puppets, right? They're the ones that are more in the public eye. But they're all playing for the same group. And they do this to sow confusion and chaos. So it's very difficult to nail down exactly who is responsible, who's the head of the beast. But I think it's out there. That's the main point that I wanted to stress on this episode, is that Tavistock, while it's a major player, it's a symbol of the huge machine of propaganda that is perpetrated on all of us, from the womb to the tomb. And as their power grows, so too do their ambitions, right? It's never enough. These people just want more and more and more and more. I think they're master sorcerers at getting people to divide themselves and not see who is really the enemy and who's really attacking them. They get us to hate people and nations that have no ill will towards us. And they justify these atrocities that we do to women and children on a daily basis. This isn't just here and there. I mean, we're part of a machine that just steamrolls people, especially women and children, every single day. These are evil, evil men. That they seem to have had a hand in every contrived bullshit story that got us into all these endless wars we wage. World War II, World War I, Korea, Vietnam, both Iraq wars, Afghanistan, Libya, Ukraine, everything. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Obviously, nowadays, our government more just attacks whoever they want. They don't even get it okayed by Congress. We're over in Syria. We're over, fighting Lebanon. We're everywhere. And they seem to have no oversight. And that's a very, very scary thing, because it's just one step away from when they outwardly do it to the people. I think they have already been attacking the American people and the people of Western society for a long time. But how long before they just do it overtly? Think about that. They've carried an all-out assault on our culture through interracial marriage, divorce on demand, abortions, blatant homosexual behaviors, taking women out of the home and having the state raise our children, and many, many other things that I'm sure we've never even heard about that'll only come out later on down the road. Sigmund Freud was the originator on the study of how broken relationships and imposed sexual repression can be used as a weapon that stirs up primitive emotions and primitive ways of thinking. Could this be why they've attacked the family unit and conditioned us to a more isolated lifestyle, while we, at the same time, live in in a place and a time where social media makes communication easier and more convenient than ever? I think so. Their plan is as evident as ever in the wholesale corruption of our political system, and how the brainwashed masses will defend this system that has never once served them. I mean, we have these people that they live in abject poverty, and they'll defend these billionaires that have hoarded enough wealth to change the lives of every person in America and in Western civilization in general, really. We see it at every level of our U.S. government, but nowhere is it more apparent than at the executive branch. Our presidents today, they wield more powers than the whole government was ever meant to have. I think that was a key factor in the Civil War, right? They wanted this federalist state that just gobbled up more and more resources and more power and just became its own beast. They've conditioned us to accept rule by this wealthy elite, these oligarchs, by glorifying wealth and opulence in every form of media. That's why we see our fellow countrymen who will defend this parasitic billionaire class while they have nothing. It's sickening, and it's crazy to me. I used to despise the people that defended these oligarchs and these parasites, and I really hated them. I couldn't understand it. But more and more I'm starting to see that they are partially to blame, but I pity them more than anything. They're so brainwashed, they don't even know it. They don't even see how they're attacked at all angles, right? And I think we all are to a degree. We all have a false sense of history. We all have a false sense of what we are and where we are in this world. And I think for the most part, we've lost our ability to think critically, and we can focus on nothing but this cult of consumerism that has been pushed on us since we could really register what was going on in the world, right? Even as small children and babies. Tavistock was a major player in the beginning of what we know today as think tanks. These people that exploit the herd mentality of man to whatever agenda they are currently pushing. These social wizards, they're experts at manipulating the mind, right? Especially of the young and weak-minded. Tavistock seems to be at the forefront of the training of the worst people in the world. These people that you'll never hear of, but whose decisions affect the lives of everyone you know. I think they've proven they shouldn't be making decisions for anyone, let alone their own families. That's just my opinion. Again, it's no secret that Dr. Coleman believed that if Tavistock and this committee of Khazar Jews leading their blind puppets weren't confronted, America as a constitutional republic would cease to exist. And I think that's more evident even nowadays than it was back in the early 2000s. If it wasn't for the foundation of this country and our Constitution, I think we wouldn't have made it even this far. In his book, Dr. Coleman said that 50 U.S. senators that he'd talked to about the future of America and the issues that were going on, when he asked them about those and what that meant for us continuing as a constitutional republic, they agreed that there's no way that we could continue down this road and keep the core of what America was made as. Of course, those senators asked to remain anonymous, and I think that's the problem, right? Our government doesn't serve us. We're governed by cowards. And our government hasn't served us for some time, if it ever did. And I honestly fear that we're way past the point where anything but violence will change that. I think that's why we have the Second Amendment. I think the people that created this nation knew the type of people that we would have to deal with. And we dropped the ball. We got complacent. We got lazy. And our kids are going to pay a big price for that, as the generation I'm part of already are. Until we're willing to sacrifice our life so our children can live in a country where they make the decisions that govern their own lives, we'll continue down this path of certain doom. We need to stand up, people. Again, I know I've said that before, but I can't say it enough. These people have shown us what a one-world government led by them will look like, right? It's destruction, it's terror, it's fear. It's a constant state of fear. How many more people need to die on top of the hundreds of millions so far for us to all wake up? Right? We need to come together. It's time to focus on what makes us the same instead of what divides us. And only then will we truly have a life worth living. And that's all I've got for this episode. I thank you all for listening. You can find us on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, Rumble, YouTube, most major platforms. I'm not on Apple yet. I'm hoping to get on there soon, even though I truly think once I do, I won't be on there long. But I love you all, and I'd like to leave you with a quote that is very near and dear to my heart, and I think relates to a lot of what we've talked about today. And it's by Ralph Waldo Emerson, a great poet and a great writer. And I think if we could embody this quote, the world would be a much better place. And it goes like this. What lies behind us and what lies before us are but tiny matters compared to what lies within us. Thank you all. I hope you have a great 2025, and you will hear from me soon. I love you.